Hi, welcome to a Black History Month edition of All Things Aviation and Aerospace. I'm Vince Mickens. I've had the privilege over the years of doing some pretty interesting Black History Month shows covering unique topics and guests, and particularly in the aviation arena. The person that I'm about to interview will share an aspect of Black history in the aviation realm of things that most are probably not familiar with. But thanks to my friend and renowned historian, John McCaskill, who is currently the Public Programs Manager for the College Park Aviation Museum located at the College Park Airport near the University of Maryland. Yes, I'll say it, Go Terps. I have been introduced to yet another iconic era of yet another untold story. So the other reason we are doing this show is because my guest will be at the College Park Aviation Museum on Saturday, March 8th at 1 o'clock p.m., and we'll tell you a little bit more about that in more details a little later. With me exclusively for this show is Pia Jordan. Pia's mom, Louise Virginia Lomax Winters, was one of the unsung Tuskegee Airmen nurses, or Army nurse, during the pivotal time when Tuskegee Airmen were exceeding expectations and leaving their indelible mark on history. Pia found her mom's story to be so compelling and intriguing, she decided to write a book and to start the development of other methods for the story to be told. Pia herself has a very long list of accomplishments, which would take the entire show to do, so we'll just give an abbreviated portion. They range from being a retired associate professor at Morgan State School of Global Journalism and Communication, as well as the Department of Multimedia Journalism, to stints at the Howard County Government Information Channel in Columbia, Maryland, and WMAR-TV in Baltimore. Pia Jordan has a broadcast journalism degree from the University of Maryland. And Pia, welcome to this special Black History Month edition of All Things Aviation and Aerospace.
Thank you so much. And too, my master's at American University in DC.
Okay. And I totally missed that on your bio, so my apologies for that. But it's great to have you on, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation about the Tuskegee Army nurses. I mean, it's just not something you hear about every day, and so it's going to be great to talk about it. You know, the first thing I was thinking of is, because one of the things you said is that you really had no idea what your mom was doing when you were growing up, other than the fact that she was in the military and things like that. And so I was wondering, when you first started to realize what kind of history she was part of and making, what went through your mind?
I could have kicked myself around her apartment. She became ill in 2006. She had several mini strokes. And so she was living independently, but I'm her daughter, her only child. And so I had to, kind of go through her apartment. And then I found one of these scrapbooks, the scrapbook that she had. Now, she wasn't really into scrapbooking. Stuff was just kind of piled in to this scrapbook. And I was looking at the pictures and I'm going, oh my goodness. These are the Tuskegee Airmen. My mother was there with the Tuskegee Airmen.
And that was your first time actually realizing that?
Yeah, I had seen this scrapbook probably when I was a preteen, but it just kind of went over my head.
Right.
And at one time, a few years earlier, my son's history teacher wanted to talk to my mother because he heard she had been in the military, but my mother wasn't really into public speaking. So I did one of those VHS tapes and asked her some questions about, her military training, but her training in nursing school. And it was like, oh my goodness, here I am. I'm moving from working in broadcast news to teaching at Morgan State University in Baltimore. And I'm going, here I am, a journalist, and I've never done anything about what my mother was a part of. So that's when a colleague of mine mentioned, she said, start it now. And so in 2008, I started formulating what I was going to do. In 2009, I started traveling, interviewing some of the airmen, and also some of the nurses who were living. They were in their 90s then,
Yeah.
or late
So,
80s and 90s.
so it makes me wonder, before we go forward and back, I wanted to ask you why do you think your mom was interested in healthcare and wanted to be a nurse?
Well, she's from Virginia, and you have to read the book to get the whole story. But there was a
You
doctor.
can give us a peek.
Well, anyway, in my book, Memories of a Tuskegee Airman Nurse and Her Military Sisters, I mentioned my mother was saying that there was a doctor in her community who was really quite respected, and his sister evidently worked with him, and she just wanted to be a part of that. And she said he was supportive, and her parents were supportive, and her grandfather, who was a Presbyterian minister, was supportive, and so that's the road she chose. And her family was really into education. So she was ready to do what it would take to get there, even though she was in a segregated society and her family was really poor, So, but she kept at it. She worked up north during, I guess, the summers to raise money to send back to her family, and waited until she could get the opportunity that they would allow her to enter the school, the nursing school in Richmond, Virginia.
Yeah, there's a couple of common denominators with your mom and others in that generation. One is they were very humble and didn't brag about what they did or anything like that. I learned that from Brigadier General Charles E. McGee, the Tuskegee Airman. He was the same way. You had to pull it out of him to find out, the things that he did and experienced and things like that. The other one is perseverance, and not letting anything stop the ultimate goal of doing, what they wanted to do, doing their job, whether it was flying an airplane or, in your mom's case, being a nurse and things like that. Did she have an idea that she specifically wanted to go into the military or be a part of the military, as far as nursing? Well, not go into the military. Yeah, go into the military and be a nurse specifically in the military. Was that something that she looked
No,
at early on?
no, because keep in mind, to be in the Army Nurse Corps during this time, if you were Black, you couldn't be in the Army Nurse Corps.
Right.
They were trying to get Black nurses into white civilian hospitals. So this was a time where the nurses could only be serving, in Black civilian hospitals. So when it opened up, because look at the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, by 1925, there was a report that said, Black men were too cowardly to be in the military, to be in
Yes,
professional positions. Basically, the men were allowed in menial jobs. If you were Black
absolutely.
man, you could go into menial jobs. And then when this 1925 Army War College report came out saying that Black men, oh, they just couldn't handle it. So by the time we're getting near possibly being part of World War II, all these groups, even the president of the United States wife, then Eleanor Roosevelt, I really like her. She was pushing to allow African Americans to be in professional positions in the military.
Yeah.
So my mother just wanted to be a nurse. She was pretty much, after she got her nursing diploma, she was working at the hospital in Richmond, um,
Okay.
because St. Philip Hospital School of Nursing was a segregated nursing school, although it was under a white administration, the Medical College of Virginia. But St. Philip Hospital was Black. They needed Black nurses to cover that.
So they
So,
wanted Black nurses to take care of Black patients.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so to be in the Army Nurse Corps, you had to been recruited by the American Red Cross. So that meant you had to have a membership in the American Red Cross. And guess what? Black women weren't allowed to be members of the American Red Cross.
Yeah.
So, so
No
I'll let you
surprise
ask
there, I
questions. We'll get into all the rest of that later.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. So she made that. So you bring up something, because I have a number of questions for you about that. But one of the things is the training. So I think you said that there were 28 nurses that were based at Tuskegee.
Yes.
Okay. And, and where I would imagine that they came from all over. So
Yes.
where did besides where your mom trained, where else did they train to
Uh,
because these were actually RNs, which I
yeah,
think it's
right.
important for people to
Right.
understand.
To be in the Army Nurse Corps, you had to have been a graduate of a nursing school and you had to be a registered nurses. These were not just some women off the street who like to take care of sick people. They were professional women who had been professionally prepared. Now, um, as I understand it, there were only like 14 nursing schools in the country that were under a white administration that were training Black nurses. All the other nurses had to be trained among Black colleges or universities, but basically Black colleges. So these nurses were coming from, and they were growing up on the East Coast from north to south, and also a couple of them were from the Midwest.
Okay.
So, so especially, see, the nurses from the South, they understood how they needed to behave,
They knew what they were dealing with.
right, going south. Now, it was some of those northern nurses that I know one nurse I talked to, her mother was concerned because her daughter was very outspoken, and she was concerned that her daughter was going to be being in service in the South. I'm talking about Tuskegee,
Yeah.
deep South.
Tuskegee, Alabama.
Yes, deep South. So the fact that these 28 nurses were going to end up in a Southern town, that was pretty major for some of them that had to deal with that. Now, one thing I'll mention, because some people, they look at me and they think I'm white, but my mother was light skinned. I'm light skinned.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, I see that, Mr. Nickens. Um, so one thing I do explain is my mother wasn't passing, but she could walk in Richmond, Virginia as a student nurse then, and she could be walking down in the community of Tuskegee and go in stores and buy things, and no one may question that she was really actually African American. Now, some of the other nurses, they had issues because they were treated poorly, and definitely the airmen, if they went into the town. That's why much of what they did, once the nurses were allowed to join the Army Nurse Corps, and maybe we better kind of backtrack on that. The only reason why Black nurses were eventually allowed in the Army Nurse Corps, and if I move my head a little
Is
bit,
is
see that
because of the
woman?
Tuskegee Airmen.
Yeah, but look, see that woman right there?
Yes. Yes.
That's Della Rainey. And Della Rainey was a nurse. She wanted to serve her country, but they told her she couldn't be in the Army Nurse Corps because she was Black. So she wrote a letter to the head person in charge of the American Red Cross, and we're talking in the 1940s right now. And she explained how she wanted to serve her country. And a lot, even talk to my mother. My mother would say that no one had to force us to go into the service. We wanted to give our life for our country. So Della Rainey wrote this letter after she'd been denied interest into the American Red Cross, which meant she couldn't become an Army nurse. They sent her a membership card. So she became she became the first African American woman in the Army Nurse Corps during World War II. And that was 1941. And that opened the door for other Black women to join the American Red Cross, which opened the door for them to become Army nurses.
So she was
But
the
still,
pioneer.
yeah, but still, there was only 56 were allowed in initially.
Yeah.
56 nurses. Now,
Yeah.
some
To
things
cover
people,
what they thought would be needed for the Tuskegee Airmen.
yeah, well, although,
But I'm sorry,
right,
didn't they also provide nursing or medical service for everybody else on the base?
uh, all the Blacks, I
Yeah, well,
believe,
that's what I mean. Yes.
yeah, because there were white people serving on these bases too, but
So
um,
what they had a white staff to take care of the whites on the base, or they
well,
left the
what I
base and went to a white hospital?
yeah, I believe they went to the White Hospital,
Oh wow.
to the VA hospital. Don't
Ah,
quote me on
okay.
that. but that they would have to go there. But look, another thing, Black nurses were only allowed to serve where there were Black personnel or German prisoners or possibly Italian prisoners.
Oh, wow.
They weren't going to serve at white hospitals or white military hospitals. They were
That's
only
great.
allowed on bases where there were Black military personnel.
So I would imagine as you were discovering everything regarding your mom's history and the Black nurses, Army nurses for Tuskegee, you probably I would imagine it was an eyebrow raiser as you dug more and more and as you interviewed more people.
Yes, actually, what's the biggest thing that people don't understand? When you went into the Army Nurse Corps, you went in as a second lieutenant. That means you're an officer.
Right.
When these nurses served at Tuskegee, these young men were pilot cadets. They may have had some college. They were like teenagers, late teens. And so they had no rank. And when I interviewed the airmen, like one of them told me, he said, we could look, but we couldn't touch because the nurses were officers and they hung with officers. And so that's the main thing that really people don't understand. Nurses, these nurses in the Army Nurse Corps were officers. They were military officers. And the airmen were pilot cadets. When they were stationed at Tuskegee, they were being trained to be pilots.
Well, I find that interesting because a lot of the pilots were very educated
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
had degrees, but they still came in as a cadet slant trainee
right.
and therefore had to salute
Yeah.
the nurses.
I think that's so funny when I tell people that.
That's
I said,
crazy.
yeah, you have to salute the nurses. And
Yeah.
so, and then I get the little stories. I won't tell you what the pilots told me, but like one of
Well, you
them,
can if you want.
no, they have to come to the program or they have to get the book.
Okay, okay,
But
so you're going to be a holdout on my show. That's fine. Go ahead.
no, I'll tell you. I'll tell you. Let's see, which one
You
will
can
I
do
tell?
it just as a tease.
Okay, I'll tell. Okay, I'll tease you. I won't tell you who told me. This is one of the pilots, the actual pilots. Um, he told me that, and another pilot told me this too, that they would pretend to be sick so that they could go down and see the nurses.
Wow, that's
That's
pretty
all
good.
I'll say. That's
Okay,
all I'll
that's a good one though. Thank you for sharing.
say.
Yeah. One of the things I was wondering is that during this period that you were doing your research and starting to work on the book and come up with other projects related to telling your mom's story and telling the Tuskegee Army nurse story,
Mhm.
there are a lot of things that have come out in terms of a few documentaries, but a number of movies. I'm thinking of some of the earlier ones like the Tuskegee Airmen, Men of Honor, and some of the more recent ones like the Red Tails and the Buffalo Soldiers, Devotion. I could go on and on. 888 one of the most recent ones.
Mhm. Yeah.
All of these are very inspiring and very enlightening stories of what African Americans were doing and not getting credit for or recognized for back in the day. Did that have influence on you as you were putting all of this together about Tuskegee Airmen nurses, Tuskegee Army nurses?
Yes. One of the things I think people will ask me about, did your mother talk a lot about this, whatever? I said, when I talk to other children of Tuskegee Airmen and nurses, that they were just mom and dad. If there was any story, it would probably just go over our heads. But that was a difficult time for them. They were born during the 1900s, early 1900s, between 1900 and probably 1920s.
Right.
And that must have been really painful. And so, growing up in Jim Crow. So I think the, how their place in history, I don't think some of them that really understood the importance of what they had accomplished in opening up the door so that by 1948, when President Truman signed the Executive Order 9981 that integrated the military, if they had been really bad pilots, the nurses had been terrible, whatever, that executive order might not have happened. They helped open the door at least for the military, to consider professional personnel, professional Black personnel to be considered to come into the military. So their importance, I think it didn't hit some of them until in later years where people were more interested in the story. But I think initially, just think about it, that even the term Tuskegee Airmen was not coined until the 1950s. That
Right.
there was an author who wrote a book, and he called them Tuskegee Airmen. And so it seemed like that's when the name stuck. But then now in the next few years, you get to see about the movies and that there's some interest. But you know what? Whenever I talk about the Tuskegee Airmen nurses, first question I ask is, have you ever heard of the Tuskegee Airmen? Do you know? And I'm talking about Blacks, whites, Latino. Some people have never heard of them,
Even these days.
even these days. So what I have to do, I do a quick, it was an experiment called experiment back then to see if African American men were smart enough to fly military planes.
Right.
I
Yeah.
set it up that way and then talk about, and they built an entire army base just to train them because it was segregated. They couldn't be trained with white pilots, cadets. So they did a whole a whole army base, which
Yeah.
talking about wasting money, that was a waste right there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but
Eh,
that's what segregation was. It was a lot of was wasteful.
yeah. And it took the first lady going up with one of them to change that dynamic dramatically.
Yeah, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, one of the things that I do with this show is I try to use it as inspiration for young people to let them know not only our history, but how important that has shaped our future and that type of thing. You authored this book, and you're working on these projects and things like that. When you look at this, what comes to mind for you in terms of how important it is for the next generation to know about it?
Well, the saying goes, if you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going, or that you may make the same mistakes. If you don't understand your history or the history of our country, you'll be making some of the same mistakes that were made in the past. So, especially for young people today, I was having a conversation recently about civics. Are our young people, do they understand how government really works? And how to be a citizen in the United States of America in a democracy, what that actually means. And so I think by telling these stories where certain freedoms, they weren't there for a group of people,
Yes.
that there were laws, the government was supporting laws that denied some citizens their inalienable rights.
Yeah.
And so, as young people, they can't take that for granted. This is part of not not just Black history. This is America's history, and you can't just sweep it under the rug. It's history. You can't change history, whether look good, bad, indifferent. It's your history.
Yeah.
So
Speaking of
so
that,
like deal with it. Come on, deal with it. You know.
the Tuskegee Airman Brigadier General Charles McGee, he believed exactly what you were saying, and he thought it was very important to share that and use that as a source of inspiration for the upcoming generation. I have to ask you this: if your mom were still with us, what do you think her perspective would be on what she experienced and what she would be seeing today if she were still around?
Woo, she died in 2011, and that's the year I kind of opened up my. Actually, it's a Tuskegee Army Nurses project, a multimedia project, and I opened it at in Maryland, where the Tuskegee Airmen were having their convention. And so, I have a website, a PowerPoint presentation, a desktop exhibit, a virtual scrapbook. So and the idea was I was doing these interviews, going around the country with my camera, because I was working on the documentary. But my mother was very soft spoken and quiet. And she, I just think she would have just having grown up under Jim Crow, um, that she would probably have thought, have we taken a step back? I mean, this is beginning to feel like what I was feeling when I was growing up in Virginia.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, but like I said, my mother would tended to be real quiet and not, put herself in the public light. So, I'm sorry she was not alive when the book came out. And
Yeah.
actually,
She's
yeah,
probably been quite proud of you with that.
yeah, but I was working, it's like I said, my background is in like visual storytelling. So what happened is, um, I went ahead and did a book proposal as I was writing an audio documentary, a video documentary. I said, let me do a book proposal. And I sent it to a publisher who I knew had done positive stories. They like to do positive stories about the South. And they were interested. And it's like, oh my goodness, I mean, I have to write it now. So what I did, I said, give me a year and I would, I would have it done. So it took me about a year to try to, pull stuff together. And of course, because I have a website, anything that didn't get in the book, I'm hoping to also include it. And I've already done that. I've included some information I found later, maybe from more research and then talking to relatives of the nurses that I included in the website, which is, since we're talking about it, www.tuskegeearmynurses.info.
Say that
So
one more time.
www.tuskegee, and Tuskegee, make sure you spell Tuskegee right. Tuskegee.
I
Actually,
can't believe
everybody,
you
look
went
at
there.
my name. My name is Pia Jordan, Tuskegee Army Nurses, and just make that one word and add .info.
Yeah.
So I try to, where I'm going to be next, where I'm making a presentation, or if I'm doing a book signing. Although my project is just me, but to answer to your questions, I think my mother would have been very surprised and proud, and all that, their story, because my book, I have something on each nurse who served on that base. Now, it might be just one paragraph on one nurse, and then it might be 2 or 3 pages on another nurse, but I found something out on every nurse
Can
on
you
that
give us
base.
some examples of some of the things that I know it's in the book, but can you give us some examples of just a few of some of the things that you discovered from the nurses that you researched?
Okay, one of the nurses I found had graduated from Friedman's Hospital School of Nursing in DC, and she had worked for a time in the hospital there. But her relatives sent me a letter that Charles Drew, who had been working there, had sent to her because they missed her after she joined the military and she was down at Tuskegee. And for those who don't know who Charles Drew is, I'm saying, you look it up. Look up who
You took
Charles
the words
Drew is.
out of my mouth.
Right, right. I'm saying, so I just want to make sure I get everything correct. But he was like the father of blood plasma, a
Yes.
black man.
Yeah.
So when
Very
somebody
renowned.
did that, it said like, yeah, a renowned doctor who has quite a story. Um, and so I saw a copy of the letter, and so I included that in the book. One of the nurses I just found out about, I was trying hard because I was going to be speaking in Alabama to find out if there were some connections about Alabama with some of the nurses. I only knew one nurse who had been born in Marion, Alabama. But there was this one nurse that was bothering me. I couldn't find, I said, okay, she was born in South Carolina, but there was a mention like she had died in Tuskegee or buried in Tuskegee or something to that effect. And I was up to the day, and this is, we're talking about 2 weeks ago. I'm trying to find out more about her. Her husband and her son, they were the senior and the junior. They were in a car accident in 1971, and they were both buried in Tuskegee.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, it's a sad story. So I'm looking at the wife, and then I find in 2009 she's she's deceased and she's buried in Tuskegee.
Mm.
And then it kind of came all together. Okay, because I'm talking to the funeral director in South Carolina, and then trying to find who's in charge of this cemetery in Tuskegee. So that told me a little bit about the connection there. Also, there was a nurse. She's from Massachusetts, and one of the nurses told me she used to play the piano on Sunday evenings. Um, and I found some documentation about a Black nurse from Massachusetts who wanted to be in the Navy nurse corps. But guess what? Back then,
Wasn't
no
happening.
Black nurses were in
It
the Navy
wasn't
nurse
it
corps.
wasn't happening. Yeah.
No, until a couple years later. But because the Army was finally open, she ended up being in at Tuskegee. Now, too, when Della Rainey was originally at Fort Bragg in North Carolina
Hmm.
and brought the group of nurses from there to Tuskegee. And then another group of nurses um, came from Louisiana, the fort there. And so initially, there were about 4 or 5 nurses who landed at Tuskegee Army Flying School on March 29th, 1942. That's when the Tuskegee nurses arrived. But at any one time, there were only 20 nurses serving on that base. But nurses come and then they're transferred to other places. So it was a total of 28 by the time they all finished.
Gotcha.
Um, yeah, so that's a little bit tidbit about a couple of the 28. Oh, and then, well, let me just say this one. One of them was like known as the sweetheart of Tuskegee. It's very beautiful, and the airmen would talk about her.
Of
But
course.
that's in the book. Um, and uh, there was little snipey little things between the nurses that
Well, they
you
were
read
human.
about in the book.
Yeah, that's cool. That would be great to read that. I'm looking forward to reading the book myself. As I said, I just learned about you and about the book and everything, but I think it's going to be a very interesting read.
Yeah.
Speaking of interesting, so with all that you've been talking about that you've done in terms of the research for the book and the interviewing and everything, I have to have you tell us about your background,
Mhm.
because you have quite the background in communications and journalism that goes back. So you want to tell us, give us some insight as to where this all came from and why you pursued journalism as a career?
Okay, well, I have to tease you with something too about General McGee. I attended Bethany College in Bethany, West Virginia for a
Oh my
couple of
goodness.
years in mass communications. And
Wow.
it wasn't until years later when I found out that they were doing a virtual event, including the colonel. I didn't know he was a graduate of Bethany.
Yeah.
And so I made sure I represented the Tuskegee Army nurses when they were going to have him on. And I let him know, I'd attended Bethany, and on behalf of the nurses, I just wanted to, give him a salute.
Nice.
So actually, I started a couple years at Bethany. Then I came back to my home state, the University of Maryland College of Journalism, and I got my degree in broadcast news.
So when did you want to know, when did you know you wanted to do communications and journalism?
Oh, probably in elementary school for the elementary school newspaper. I would always be writing. I would do little writing this, writing that.
You wrote
When
for your elementary school newspaper?
yeah, I think my name was on there for something. I have it. As a matter of fact, I got it over there. The actual newspaper, and I think I saw my name, and I'm saying, what did I write anything, whatever. But then in junior high, I think I did a little something, something. But by high school, I joined the newspaper staff. Now, unfortunately, my interest was more in broadcast because I was like, Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather. Those were my men.
Those were
So
yeah.
those were
Peter
the
Jennings.
journalists.
Yeah.
So
The real
I
deal.
yeah, I wanted to I wanted to be that. I'm gonna be. investigative kind of reporter. But no, I usually did more soft things. But so my high school, unfortunately, they did not have a broadcast component. They just had print. So I went into print. But by the time I went into first mass comm at Bethany, um, so I was learning how to tell like visual stories to how to write for how you speak. There's a difference which how you read and how you speak. So it's more of a
Absolutely.
conversational sort of. So I'm saying all this if anyone needs me to train them. But I'm sorry, getting off subject. But then I just had internships. When I was in West Virginia at Bethany College, I worked at, it was a radio television station, WTRF TV there. I worked as an intern there. Then when I transferred to Maryland, I worked at, now since you're in Maryland, I worked at WJLA TV as
Hmm. Channel
a copy
7
desk
ABC.
assistant. I
Yep.
worked at the ABC News as a TV desk assistant later. And then I was with Channel 9 back in the late 70s into 80s with their reporter training program.
Hmm.
So I was in that. And so eventually I worked at, I did a lot of like a freelance sort of things, hosting on this show, producing on this gospel show, until eventually I finally got a job as an associate producer at Channel 2, WMAR TV in Baltimore, Maryland. And then
Right.
from there, I got the opportunity to anchor, host my own talk show, do everything at what was then called Cable 15 and then GTV. It was a government channel in Columbia, Maryland. So um, I don't know, I just like researching, getting information, and making it understandable. I like
Sure.
doing stories that, basically put smiles on people's faces, but also to really go into some, detail about, what's going on. And even though I'm not a print person, I had to be trained in print too. Just because you're in broadcast news, you also have to be trained in print. But
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah, but that's why it was kind of funny that I would end up first doing a book because my expertise is in a different direction. But my book, as one person told me, it has so much details. It's like finding out about the lives of 28 different women who come from different parts of the country and how you put them all in this one city, a city where probably the people in that city didn't really like having Black men with guns in Tuskegee, Alabama. But they had to kind of do things and stay close to base because there were incidents that quickly caused them to build more of a life together as a community on that base. And so um, it's just, and I'll just share this and people can take it for whatever it's worth. I drove by the actual base last week um,
Oh, that's
when I
funny.
was
I was there recently too. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I spoke at, let's see, when was it? February 20th of this year, 2025. I spoke at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And so while I was there, I said, I gotta drive down to Tuskegee. So I drove down to the National Historic Site, which is not the actual base for the Tuskegee Airmen. The actual base is privately owned, but over the years, I developed a relationship with the owners. And basically, what the owners did, the son told his father of the historical significance of that property. So they had this beautiful sign up, Tuskegee Army Flying School, with the different emblems on at a gate, a gate, and they had cleared the property. I laugh because there was a sign still up there that it said Lena Horn Way. The curbs were still there. Some
Yeah.
of the chimneys were still there. So one time I drove by myself, and this feeling of just fear came over me. And
Mm.
I'm going, you know what? Just think of the fear of the people who were on that base because they're surrounded by a community who really really don't want them there. However, Tuskegee Institute is there, and that's why the air base was really there, because they had a civilian pilot program,
Right.
and it was nice weather in that part of Alabama. So, but when I went by there, and this we're talking 2011, when I think I first went by there, and how they had cleared the land, and we drove through it, and I saw where the planes would have been flying from, and all. But
Yeah.
when I went by it last week, the sign was kind of almost in the wind. The sign was down.
Mm.
It was now, there's a
Yeah.
fence covering the whole thing, because actually the owners were own a lumber company. They were building, I mean, not building, but they were planting trees around the base, because the son had told his father about the historical significance. And actually, some of the airmen had come on the base, and the owner had put up a flag where the administration building had been. But as of last week, it's just, I almost wanted to cry, because I'm saying it's like, I mean, it's been privately owned by different owners over the decades, but it's like now when I saw the sign kind of just
Yeah.
hanging loose.
Hey, given what you know and everything, if you had an opportunity to go back to 1942, what do you think how do you think you would do? What do you think your take would be on that?
I don't even want to think about it. I don't want to go back there. Uh-uh. I, I,
You
I,
wouldn't want to
I,
have anything to do with it,
I
huh?
would, no, no. What was going, I'm almost crying now just thinking about what was going on. Because there's still, well, think about it, up until even in the 1960s, until the civil rights laws were passed. For now, if I had been there in 1942, um, I would have grown up in that environment, so I would have known what would have been expected of me. And then, too, may have been like my mother. I probably could have walked around, and people would assume that I was white. So I might not have had the same sort of issues that my darker skinned colleagues would have had. But I wouldn't even want. I think I would have been like my mother. I would just kind of keep quiet and just be observant and all. But I'd want to live.
Sure.
I'd want to live, and so I didn't want to tell my story from the grave.
I hear
So
you on that.
yeah, so 1942. No, I'm glad.
No.
I'm glad I was born in the late 50s. Even then, I was dealing with some
Some
segregation.
stuff. Yeah, yeah. I hear you loud and clear on that one. So, a couple of things. In 1948, President Truman signed an executive order to desegregate the military.
Mhm.
Also created what they call the Committee of Equality of Treatment and Opportunities in the Armed Services, which it's kind of interesting to talk about something like that now in 2025 with all that's going on in terms of things, well, in terms of all of that. But what I was going to ask you is, as these nurses, finish their quote unquote tour and everything, what types of things did they do moving forward as they finished up with the Tuskegee Airmen, uh,
Well,
Army nurse?
some of the nurses, they got out. They
Okay,
they didn't continue. Now, my mother, she remained in the military.
she
So,
did.
yeah, she went in as a second lieutenant. She stayed in the military 10 years. And when she left the military, she was a first lieutenant. But one of the things I'll mention, and two, if you go to the National Historic Site, they have a display where they said, like, where did they go later? My mother's picture is up there. One of the things that being in the military offered sometimes some professional development in other areas. I mean, these nurses went in, they were nurses. So they had they were trained as nurses. But the military offered like psychiatric nursing training. So my mother, after she was at Tuskegee, because Tuskegee started closing down in 46. So she was eventually transferred to Lockbourne Air Force Base in Columbus, Ohio, as as were several of the other nurses who remained in the military. And while there, she was transferred to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., where she was in a psychiatric training program. And guess what? When she did come out of the service, guess who hired her?
I can only imagine.
St. Elizabeth hired her. The
Wow.
federal mental institution in Washington, D.C. Now it's under the D.C. government, as I understand it. But St. Elizabeth, she ended her career at St. Elizabeth.
Wow.
Some of the other nurses, they also went and civilian hospitals. Some of the nurses remained in the military, and I don't know. Do you know? She just died a couple of weeks ago. Nancy Lieutenant Colon.
No.
She, she was the first African American nurse in the Army Nurse Corps, the regular Army Nurse Corps in I guess it was 48 when
Was
uh
she recently recognized at the Women in Aviation International? Am I correct?
probably she died. She was 104 years old.
Yeah. I,
And she just died. And she was with my mother. I interviewed her about my mother, but she just died a few weeks ago. And
wow.
but it's just interesting. Her last name was Lieutenant, Nancy Lieutenant.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, I said, who would have thought to have a name Lieutenant and you went in as a lieutenant. So,
Yeah.
but her married name Colon. So she was also the first woman and probably the only woman who became president of the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated. She was their national president for a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, are any of the nurses still around, or have they all passed?
As far as I know, unless, someone has been kind of holding out on me, I don't know any who are still remain. Now, when I did my research, I was finding out also where their remains are, or um, and I found out basically there were a few that I'm not sure about. I even had a family, some grandchildren contacted me and they asked me about, did I know of a certain nurse? And I said, do you mean such and such nurse? And they said, well, that was their grandmother and she was living with them. And I wish I had known that earlier, but evidently the grandmother wasn't in any shape to be interviewed by then. Um,
Mm,
but as
yeah.
far as I know, um, all 28 of them that I have documentation for most of their deaths. But see, that's one of the things I'm hoping when I do these presentations that if there are some family members out there, or I mean, just people who have knowledge about these nurses, if they would come forward. Because, even when I talk to some family members, um, they may not have known that their relative, had anything to do with the Tuskegee Airmen. It's like it wasn't,
Right.
it's not something that was really talked a whole lot about.
Yeah.
You don't, one of the nurses, she saw herself. There's a picture of four of the nurses around this airplane, and she was taking a nursing history course, and she saw the picture, and she didn't realize that she was a part of a history. And so even too, when I did the presentation at the Tuskegee Airmen Convention in 2011, one of the military nurses came up, and she was almost in tears when she was looking at my tabletop exhibit, and she was saying how if it wasn't for these women, how they helped open the door for her to be in the military.
Oh,
And so,
wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so that
Yeah.
was just so moving.
Yeah. So let's talk about next Saturday, the 8th, when you're going to
Yes,
be at the College Park Aviation Museum. You're going to be
yes,
there to do a book signing, and you're doing a presentation, right?
yes, I am. I'm going to be doing a presentation, and then people can ask me questions, and hope we'll have a whole bunch of fun just talking about a subject that most people have never heard about.
What's you've touched on it a little bit. What's the response that you get when you do these in-person presentations from people as they discover an area that's a great era of in terms of African American accomplishment.
Well, actually, I did one last night. I did a book signing and I talked a little bit about it. And it's like people, it's like, I've never heard of this before. And then, like I said, some people I'll ask the question, have you ever heard of the Tuskegee Airmen? And no, I haven't heard of the Tuskegee Airmen. So it's like surprise. They say, I never even thought about anybody else. Because when you have an army base, you've got
Yeah,
to have some people to help run it. And
right.
and
Yeah,
so I always talk
exactly.
about that. Yeah, I always talk about that. I said, and one
Doesn't
thing,
run itself.
right, right. And one thing, Charles Dryden, who was one of the
Yes.
yeah, and he was married to one of the nurses. One of the things he said in his book was that for every airman, there were 10 support people, and that included nurses. And so you think of the airmen, and sometimes, I talk to people and they might say, well, the airmen, they're into, the story is really about them. But those people in the background, if it wasn't for them, making sure the plane was flying, making sure you were eating in the mess hall, and that when you got sick, and my book talks about some of the ones that they were sick, and my mother was the nurse, um, that if you didn't have them there, that it would have been difficult um, for them to survive. And
Sure.
actually, and my mother mentions this too, that the nurses, their support, it was it was more than just about the physical. And my mother talked about that. It was more than just the physical. They were there. My mother said she could be a sounding board. Because remember,
Right.
the
Yeah.
nurses
I
were
can only
professionals.
imagine.
Yeah. And um, so it was I think for all the women who ended up being there, it's like one of the nurses who was married to the one of the first five who graduated. His name was Mac Ross. She was a real close friend of my mother. And fortunately, she allowed me to interview her because she wasn't talking to anybody, but
Hmm.
she was married and she died in 2020, as did Charles Dryden's wife, the former wife, Irma Cameron Dryden. And both of them died in 2020, but Abby Voorhees Ross, and she remarried, Diverges, she was 102. And um, she and my mother were real close. And I lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Okay, anyway, the, the two of them, they were very close. Actually, let me see. Is she in this picture? I need to move. I think she might not have been in this picture, or she might be up a little higher. She's
A
in
little
one of
higher.
the, I know she's
Gotcha.
kneeling in one of the pictures, but she was married to Mac Ross. And Mac Ross, he died overseas. But, you know, that part of history, just knowing she was there, she was one of the older nurses,
Right.
and she was married to one of the five who actually the first group that graduated with Davis, um, and all the rest of them was Spanky Roberts, and I'm trying to remember the Lemuel Custis and DeBow.
Yeah.
Um,
So,
so
as we kind of wrap things up, I wanted to make sure that we tell everybody how they can find out more information about Saturday, March 8th, that it does start at 1 o'clock there at the Tuskegee, at the College Park
College Park.
Aviation Museum. And they can find out more information by the going to the website or actually emailing College Park Aviation at pgparks.com. And the phone number there is 301 864 6029. That's 301 864 6029. And then they can also contact you directly via your website, I think you said?
Yes, which is Tuskegee Army Nurses.info.
Gotcha. And if you guys, as in our audience, if you have specific questions, you're welcome to ask specifically for John McCaskill. He's the program manager there at the College Park Museum, and it's at the museum. By the way, is very cool. it's a great place to visit and to explore the various exhibits and everything. And then it's at a historic airport, College Park Airport. So it's
Not
overall
down
just
the
a
street
great
from the
thing to do.
University of Maryland.
And I'm sorry, what about University of Maryland?
It's down the street from the, a
What
few
about
miles
University
from
of
the
Maryland? No, I'm
University.
just kidding.
Go Terps.
The Terps, of course. So, hey, listen, as we wrap up, I always like to kind of let my guests give a few final words about their thoughts about what we've talked about. In your case, you've been a professor, you've taught a lot of students, and inspired a lot of young people in terms of their careers. Yours has been focused primarily on broadcast journalism, et cetera. But in the scheme of things, of everything, what's your general thoughts and recommendations to the next generation as they come up into our world, you know, of aviation and just in general?
In aviation and just in general, read. Read as much as you can about history, about if aviation is your interest, if that's your subject, if that you want to become a pilot, or if you're going to be a nurse, or no matter what you're going to be, you have purpose. But it's important to be prepared, and that part of that preparation is not just understanding a subject, but is knowing what went into that subject. What is the history of whatever you're going into? So that's my education. It's still so important, no matter what you're into, whether it's technical, whether it's education. But that is so important.
Yeah. Pia Jordan, the author of Memories of a Tuskegee Airman Nurse and Her Military Sisters. I'm sure I'm looking forward to reading that book. I think it's great. I look forward to meeting you on Saturday the 8th. There we go. and meeting you in person. And I hope that everybody gets your book and reads it, because it's some great history that we've talked about and that you've written about. So thank you very much for taking the time to be on All Things Aviation and Aerospace. Really appreciate having you here.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and I hope I see all my peeps from Maryland show up.
Well, now that you've put it that way, they probably will. So you've been watching. Thank you very much, Pia. You've been watching and listening to All Things Aviation and Aerospace, a production of the Private Air Media Group, executive produced by me, Vince Mickens. I welcome you to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, as well as look for the links on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. I hope that you've enjoyed this Black History special and are very much inspired to read Pia Jordan's book. Remember, Pia will be at the College Park Aviation Museum, as we said, on Saturday, March 8th, beginning at 1 p.m. For more details, you can either email collegeparkaviation@pgparks.com or call 301-864-6029. Also, you're welcome to please message me on LinkedIn or Facebook if you have any questions that may not have been covered. Till next time, please stay safe, fly safe if you're a pilot like me, and blue skies.